What did Jerusalem actually look like before Rome destroyed it? Jesus told his disciples that not one stone of the temple will be left standing on another. 40 years later, in 70 AD, Roman legions under Titus burned the city to the ground. So, was Jerusalem, in its final years, a modest religious town, or one of the most staggering cities on earth? Let's find out. We will start with what most people already know, and then go looking for what they don't. Everyone who has read the Gospels knows the disciples once pointed out the temple buildings to Jesus, impressed by their size. What almost nobody realizes is exactly how staggering that structure actually was. The Jewish historian Josephus, a former priest who saw it with his own eyes before the destruction, describes a building whose front was covered in massive plates of gold. So much gold that at sunrise it reflected a blaze of light so fierce, he says, that people had to look away, exactly as they would from the sun itself. The parts that were not gold, he writes, were so brilliantly white that from a distance, travelers approaching Jerusalem said the temple looked like a mountain covered in snow. In a desert country, glowing white and gold on a hilltop. This was not a small building. This was King Herod's temple, not the modest Weeping Elders version rebuilt after the Babylonian exile, but a massive, decades-long reconstruction project Herod began around 20 BC, specifically to win the loyalty of a Jewish population that never fully trusted him. And winning loyalty through architecture meant thinking bigger than anyone in Jewish history ever had. Tradition forbade making the sanctuary itself larger than Solomon's original, so Herod did something else instead. He doubled the size of the platform around it. Later Jewish tradition, recorded in the Mishnah, remembers the finished enclosure as roughly 500 cubits by 500 cubits, a figure ancient writers themselves did not fully agree on, since Josephus describes it slightly differently in his two separate accounts. What is not in dispute is the platform still standing today. The Temple Mount, as it survives now, covers roughly 35 acres, one of the largest raised platforms anywhere in the ancient world. And some historians have compared its footprint to several times the size of the Roman Forum, built not by Rome, but by a client king trying to impress the very empire he answered to. And this is where the hidden story starts, because building it should not have been physically possible. Mount Moriah was a natural, uneven hilltop. Herod's engineers didn't work around that problem. They buried it. They built colossal retaining walls, some stones inside them 30 to 40 feet long and weighing dozens of tons apiece, and packed the space between the walls and the natural rock with rubble and fill until the entire mountaintop had been transformed into one enormous, level, artificial platform. Modern archaeologists studying the surviving stones, the very ones that still form the base of the Western Wall today, describe it as one of the most ambitious engineering projects attempted anywhere in the Roman-era world. Rome had aqueducts and roads. Judea, under a half-Idumean client king everyone in Jerusalem quietly despised, had built one of the largest man-made platforms on earth. And the temple was only the crown of a much larger city. Climb down from that platform and you will be standing in one of the busiest urban centers in the Eastern Roman world. To the west and south, the upper city rose on higher ground, the neighborhood of the priestly aristocracy and the wealthy, its houses excavated by archaeologists in the 20th century, and found floored with imported mosaics, decorated with Roman-style frescoed walls, and equipped with private ritual baths cut into the bedrock, a level of luxury that would not have looked out of place in Rome itself. Below it, in the lower city, and along the Tyropion Valley, ran the markets and workshops that kept a pilgrim economy running. Stalls selling sacrificial animals, money changers converting foreign currency into temple-approved coin. and a broad, stepped street, uncovered by archaeologists beneath centuries of debris, that once carried crowds of worshippers straight up toward the temple gates. Streets, shops, mansions, and a river of pilgrims moving through all of it. This was the city Jesus rode into on a donkey, not a quiet religious outpost, but a working, glittering, overcrowded capital. But size alone is not the part of this story most people miss. The real hidden detail is who was allowed to stand where. Inside that enormous city, the temple complex was not one open space. It was a series of increasingly restricted rings, each one closer to God, each one closing off more of humanity behind it. The outer court, the largest area, was called the Court of the Gentiles, open to anyone of any nation who wanted to come pray or simply look. This was the fulfillment, in stone, of Solomon's old prayer that foreigners would come to God's house and be heard. But go one step further, and the openness stopped. A low stone barrier called the soreg ran around the inner courts, and this is where the story becomes something you can actually hold in your hand today. In 1871, an archaeologist named Charles Clermont-Ganneau discovered a limestone slab near the Temple Mount, carved in formal Greek capital letters. It had once been mounted directly on that barrier. The inscription reads, and this is not interpretation, this is the literal translated text: "No foreigner is to enter within the balustrade and the embankment around the sanctuary. Whoever is caught will have himself to blame for his ensuing death." This is not a story from the Bible. It is a physical object, and it exists today in the Istanbul Archaeology Museum. Josephus himself describes this exact barrier and confirms the warning was real, enforced in both Greek and Latin. And remarkably, Rome allowed the Jewish authorities to carry out the death penalty for crossing it, even if the trespasser happened to be a Roman citizen. Think about what that means. Somewhere in the middle of the most cosmopolitan religious site on Earth, a place visited, according to ancient estimates, by hundreds of thousands of pilgrims at Passover alone, there stood a physical wall with a death threat carved into it, separating the nations from the people of the covenant. So imagine the city now, not as ruins, but as it actually stood. A hilltop the size of dozens of football fields, plated in gold, ringed by colonnades, packed with pilgrims from across the Roman world, all funneling inward through zone after zone of increasing holiness. Gentiles, then Jewish men, then Jewish women, then priests, then finally, once a year, one man alone standing before an empty room. Below the temple platform, the upper city held the mansions of the wealthy priestly families, floored in imported mosaic and decorated in styles borrowed straight from Roman villas. The population swelled dramatically during festivals. Ancient estimates range wildly, with Josephus offering numbers modern historians consider inflated. But even conservative modern scholarship puts festival crowds well into the hundreds of thousands, flooding a city whose normal population may have been closer to 50 or 60,000. Jerusalem, in its final decades, was not a sleepy provincial town. It was one of the most visited, most photographed in modern terms, most architecturally ambitious cities in the entire Roman world. Built almost entirely by a king the Jewish people never fully accepted as their own. But besides this, a detail puts the crowd size in a way raw population figures never quite manage. Josephus records that the Roman governor Cestius Gallus, wanting to understand the scale of Passover, once had the priests count the lambs sacrificed for a single festival. And the tally came back at 256,500 animals. Since Jewish law required a minimum of 10 people to share each Passover lamb, That count alone implies well over 2 million participants passed through the temple courts that week. Modern historians think both Josephus's count and that multiplier are almost certainly exaggerated. Ancient writers routinely inflated numbers for effect, and no ancient city had the infrastructure to genuinely host millions at once. But even discounted heavily, the ancient sources agree on the basic picture. A city built for tens of thousands, absorbing a population many times its size, funneling all of them through one golden hilltop, once a year, on a schedule that had not changed in centuries. And none of it saved it. In the year 70, after a brutal siege, Roman legions under Titus broke through the walls, and the temple that had blazed like the sun burned instead. Josephus, who witnessed the war firsthand, describes the city afterward as leveled so completely that visitors who had known it before could not believe anything had ever stood there. For centuries afterward, this was treated as history recorded only in text. Josephus's account, and the words of Jesus decades earlier that not one stone would be left on another, came to fulfillment. But in 1968, that year, the archaeologist Benjamin Mazar began excavating along the southern wall of the Temple Mount. And beneath centuries of accumulated debris in the Tiropoian Valley, his team uncovered a Herodian-era street. Paved, intact, running directly alongside the base of the temple's retaining wall. And on that street, exactly where they had landed in the summer of 70 AD, lay massive fallen stones from the temple walls above. Some of the very ashlars described earlier, still resting where they crashed down, with the paving stones beneath them visibly cracked and buckled from the impact. The excavators did not need to reconstruct this scene or guess at it. Nobody had touched it in 19 centuries. It had simply been buried exactly as it landed the moment it happened. Among that wreckage, Mazar's team recovered a smaller carved stone, cut with a niche on one face, and inscribed in Hebrew with the words, "To the place of trumpeting." Josephus, writing decades before the stone was ever rediscovered, had already described this exact station. A spot on the roof of the temple's southwest corner where a priest stood each week to sound a trumpet, announcing the start and the close of the Sabbath to the entire city below. The stone had fallen roughly 130 feet from that corner and lay untouched on the shattered street until Mazar's team lifted it out of the rubble. Jerusalem was a city with mansions floored in mosaic, markets running on pilgrim traffic, a hilltop platform among the largest ever built in the ancient world, sealed off in rings of sacred space with a stone wall bearing a death threat to keep the nations at bay. And underneath all of it, sitting untouched for 19 centuries, the actual fallen stones match, piece for piece, the words Jesus spoke on that hillside decades before a single one of them hit the ground. And that leaves one question hanging in the dirt of that excavation. What actually happened inside those walls in the months before the fire that turned one of the ancient world's great cities into rubble so fast that even the Romans who did it were stunned by what they found?